Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome to the latest in our series of Doha Debates, sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. Ever since the 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center, the so-called war on terror has been a dominating feature of international relations. It spawned new alliances, but also new violence and new hatreds. So is it a fight to protect Western freedoms or a battle against a religion and ideology that the West doesn't understand? The motion tonight is that this House believes the war on terror has become a war against Islam, and you'll hear some pretty impassioned arguments both for and against that proposition. But as always, at the end of the debate, it's you, the audience, who will give your verdict and have the final say. On my right, and in favour of the motion, Anas Al-Takriti. He's a founder and former president of the Muslim Association of Britain. He campaigned actively against the war in Iraq and is a frequent commentator and writer on Middle Eastern affairs. Also in favour, Dr. Mustafa Ceric, who as Grand Mufti of Bosnia needs very little introduction. For 2 million Muslims in the Balkans, he is the leading Islamic legal authority. But tonight, he's content to just fight it out as a panellist. Against the motion, we have from New York, Faisal Abdul Rauf. He's author of the book, What's Right with Islam. He's also founder of the Cordoba Initiative, designed to improve relations between the US and the Muslim world. But his day job is imam at a mosque just a dozen blocks away from Ground Zero. With him to oppose is Ramzi Khouri, a former editor of the Arab Daily. He's now a communications advisor to a number of Arab governments. Let's hope that doesn't make him too careful about what he says tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. And now let me call first of all on Anas Al-Takriti to speak for the motion, please.
Thank you very much. Whilst the war on terror may have started with multi-objectives, several layers of aims and targets and the such, there can be little doubt that over recent times, possibly over the past 2.5 years, all those have gone to the sidelines, and what is left is a predominant objective, and that is to fight not only Muslims in their physical presence and existence, but also Islam, in the set of principles, its codes, its essence, and its context. Now, whilst I'm the first to admit that this is a very complex issue, but I would like to try to simplify it as much as possible by referring to three matters that drive this war on terror. The first being the ideology. There can be little question that when the likes of Henry Kissinger, Richard Perle, Daniel Pipes and the such speak of the necessity for the West to recognize that it is fighting a set of ideology, not just some savages that are hiding in caves, we have to pay attention. It is essential that we realize that this is an ideological, idea-driven war against Islam. And there is a recognition and acknowledgement that Islam represents not only physical presence, but also that set of ideas and principles. The second matter is the discourse. Who amongst us can actually turn the other way when the British Prime Minister or the United States President speak that it is the extreme straight of Islam that represents the actual enemy to the West, an enemy to the ways and lifestyles of the West? Who of us can actually turn to the other way when the likes of the Italian Prime Minister say that the Western civilization is superior to Islamic civilization and that it is going to defeat it? We can't. And finally, practice. However loud I speak tonight, I will never be able to speak louder than the guns, the fighter jets, and the bullets and the presence of hundreds of thousands of American and Western troops in countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq, and guns that are targeting other countries such as Iran, Syria, Sudan, Pakistan, amongst many others. My friends, there can be little doubt that this war on terror has gradually but surely changed and transformed into a war on Islam. Thank you very much.
Anas Al-Takriti, thank you very much indeed. You talked about a predominant objective to fight Muslims. Was it a hostile act to arrange free elections in Afghanistan and Iraq when there weren't any in Iraq for decades?
In a sense, it was neither. elections
So you're going to sit on the fence here?
I'm not going to sit on the fence.
You accuse the West of waging a war on Islam, but when I give you two examples, you sit on the fence and say it's not.
No, an election that's whereby the voters have no idea who the candidates are is not an election with due respect, Tim.
Millions of people in Iraq voted, didn't they? Millions.
Well, they voted simply because out of hope and desperation, rather than anything else. The reality is that in the United Kingdom, we've had our elections, and if I was going to be voting for a number rather than a name and a face and a manifesto, I wouldn't be pleased at all. Why is it that the Iraqi people or the Afghanis should be pleased that they vote for numbers? I don't think they should.
So they're not free-thinking? You have a pretty low opinion of Islamic
absolutely
thought.
Not. In fact, I think that's what we're seeing throughout not only the Arab but the Muslim world, and particularly in Iraq and such. I see that there is a wave of not only intellectual and liberal thinking in order to face and to counter that campaign, but also there is another force that is resisting that kind of imposition of the westernization of Islam and Muslims.
You talked about comments by Tony Blair and President Bush. Let me just want to comment by you. We cannot clear our names unless we own up to the shameful fact that terrorism has become an Islamic enterprise, an almost exclusive monopoly implemented by Muslim men and women. That's not from Tony Blair or President Bush. That's from the boss of Al Arabiya, Abdurrahman Al-Rashid.
Well, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Al-Rashid and I would differ immensely on various issues. However, I would be the very first to admit that every single ideology, every religion, has its three straits. It has its liberals, it has its fundamentals, and it has its mainstream moderates.
Anas Al-Tikriti, thank you very much indeed. Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf.
I'd like to begin, Tim, by pointing out that terrorism has been defined by experts of political science as the targeting of innocent civilians in order to achieve political ends. This has happened since the beginning of time, even since the beginning of the Roman Emperor. Our role as the religious voices are to be the conscience of our communities. There are two Islams, you might say. There is the Islam that was taught by the Prophet Muhammad, by his companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and his noble companions, what we call the Islam of as-Salaf as-Salih, the pious predecessors. And we have the Islam of the Khawarij. The Islam of the Prophet Muhammad is based upon the Quranic commandment to him and the statement that God did not send Muhammad except to be a mercy to humankind, ar-rahmatan lil-alameen, not to be ar-rahbatan lil-alameen, not to be a terrorizer of humanity. Very briefly, Tim, the Khawarij was the first phenomenon in Islamic history. It was a group that developed a takfiri political philosophy, that which identified anyone who disagreed with them as being unbelievers and created a political philosophy that justified murdering fellow Muslims, including their innocent wives and children. But the Prophet's Islam and the Prophet's son-in-law and cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, had to fight this group militarily in order to protect Islam. Ultimately, they assassinated him. But very simply, Tim, this is the outline of the battle that currently is waged within the Muslim Ummah. The battle between the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad, the battle of the Islam of the Salaf as-Salih, and the Islam of the 21st century Kharijis who have waged terrorism and under the veneer of Islam.
Imam, thank you very much indeed. You do not believe that the West is waging a war against Islam?
Not at all. I don't believe that the war is waged against Islam as a religion. Islam as a religion, as you pointed out, is based upon the 5 fundamental acts of worship. When the Prophet was asked, what is Islam by Gabriel in the hadith that we Muslims all know, he was told it is the belief in God, the practice of prayer, giving charity, fasting the month of Ramadan, going to Hajj in some versions of this hadith. There's no war against this in the West.
What are Muslims then to make of the discrimination that they've suffered, the kind of racial profiling, for instance, in the United States? What are they to make of that?
Well, that is certainly one of the things we have to combat because, as you very well pointed out, Tim, you quoted the end editor of the newspaper who said the majority of terrorism is done today by Muslims. And therefore, there is a perception, and we have to delink the notion of terrorism done by Muslims from the vast majority of Muslims in both the Muslim world and in the West who are practicing their faith, who are protected, and who are embraced within Western society.
Imam, thank you very much indeed. Grand Mufti, may I ask you to speak for the motion, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel like an old sheikh that used to ask his audience, do you know what I'm going to tell you? They would say no, because they don't know. And then said, if you don't know, it is useless to talk to you anyway. So the next day they said half of them will say, we know, and the half of them will say no, to see what the sheikh will say. And they said it. And then he said that the half that knows should inform the half that doesn't know. And the third day, the sheikh said, do you know what I'm going to talk to you? They said, yes. And he said, if you know what I'm going to tell you, then there is no need to speak to you. I have no now way to escape, Tim, from talking to you about very sensitive and very important issues of today regarding where is the Islam and whether Islam is attacked or whether it is a war against Islam after it was war against terror. I don't believe that anyone can fight Islam and can win against Islam. But I do believe that the context in which we have the war against terror is implied the war against those who said that they were acting on behalf of Muslims, committing certain terrorist attacks in New York, Washington, then Madrid, 2004, and in Holland, 2004 in November. I'll give you one fact. First, today Muslims make up almost 1.5 billion of the world population, but have no permanent chair in the Security Council of the United Nations. Is it necessary that one be an enemy to the West so to become a permanent member of the Security Council, like in the case of the former Soviet Union and China? The fact, too, not being permanent members of the Security Council of the UN, Muslims have no veto power over the issue of war and peace in the world, but still they are accused to be the cause for world conflicts from Palestine to Chechnya and from Kashmir to Darfur. Who is then responsible for the war and peace in the world? Those who have the power to win the peace or those who have no power to start the war? The fact 3, out of the world refugees today, 70% are Muslims. How is it then that we are faced with a logic that says, although not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims, including those refugees who are asking to be free to go back home? Finally, coming to Bosnia, you know that Karadzic is a Christian, Orthodox Christian. On the 10th of the anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica, Karadzic is free. And the Chief Army General Rasim Delic, that was fighting for survival in Bosnia, is in The Hague. And you tell me who is fighting whom and who is against whom. Thank you very much.
Grand Mufti, thank you very much indeed. You talked about your own home ground in Bosnia. Was it a war on Islam for the West to bomb the Serbs after they had been massacring Muslims? Was that evidence of a war against Islam?
No, that was against the Serbs, and thank you very much
for asking
me. And I use the opportunity to thank the American people whose sons are still in Bosnia and Herzegovina and making me possible to live in Bosnia and Herzegovina peacefully, and I wish that they will stay.
So one moment it's a war against Islam, and the next moment it's not.
There is another phase. There is a phase of that story, which means that the intervention came after 4 years of the concentration camps of the Auschwitz of Sarajevo and after the massacre and genocide in Srebrenica. It came, but it was too late.
Isn't it true that hatred has been preached, I put this to you as Grand Mufti, from too many Islamic pulpits, by too many Islamic clergy?
I would not say too many, but there are some people who are frustrated, who are unhappy, and who don't know how to express
It's more than that. It's hatred that has been preached, isn't it?
Excuse me?
It is hatred that has been preached.
Yes, there
Otherwise,
are
why
some
did the
people.
Saudi authorities feel the need to sack so many
I don't
imams?
want to justify the hatred of some Muslims by saying that we hear the hatred from the Christians and Jews. I think that we have to stop hatred from all sides.
Grand Mufti, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to throw the questions open to the audience in a little while, but first let me ask Ramzi Khouri to speak against the motion.
Well, Tim, I am against the motion because this war is all about oil. This war is all about furthering the interests of Israel, whether they may be security interests or geopolitical interests. This war is about expanding the American military presence in this region. To say or to suggest that the war on terror has become a war on Islam is to say that American foreign policy in the region has changed. There is absolutely no proof of such change. American foreign policy has always been steadily a policy of double standards when it came to Israel, a policy of I am the power and you are the underdog. This is American foreign policy. Nothing has changed. But the war on terror that started...
Are you speaking for the motion or against the motion?
There is no war.
You appear to be speaking
the
for
war
it.
on terror, Tim. No, absolutely not. I am all against the idea that the war on terror has become a war on Islam. The war on terror may have become a war on Iraq that is unfair. It may have started with good merit, going after Osama bin Laden and those people who committed 9/11, who chopped people's head on television, those people who ruined the name of Islam, is a war that is being conducted today by Muslim nations. It is not an American war against terror. It's an international, multinational, multi-faith war against terror. This is what is going on. This is not a war against Islam. There are many problems with America. There is a huge problem with American foreign policy, Tim, and most importantly is how the neoconservatives are running this administration in Washington, D.C. And let us take a look at their doctrine. Their doctrine is not a doctrine of religion. They have absolutely nothing against Islamists. For the first time ever in history, these neoconservatives have put their hands with what is unheard of. The Islamist Shiites in Iraq. It's never happened before. This is a godless war.
Ramzi Khouri, thank you very much indeed. You say it's a godless war, but can you understand why Muslims are particularly angry that the Palestinians have been left to rot in refugee camps decade after decade while the West bangs on about protecting its freedoms and values?
Of course I can understand why the Palestinians are angry.
That's not a war against Islam?
No, that's a war against Palestinian independence. The American administration
has
has
always
always
shared
had
by many Muslims around the world, is it? Your view is not shared
here
by
I am,
many
I'm a
Muslims.
Palestinian Christian sitting here. I have suffered because of Israeli occupation. I have relatives who are paying a major price in Palestine. Some of them have died and have been killed by Israel. Shall we say today and declare today that Israel is the enemy of Christianity? This is a war against Christianity.
But I'm talking about the attitude of the West. Take Chechnya, for instance, the blind eye that the West has turned to the human rights violations carried out by Russian forces in Chechnya. You don't see that as aimed against Muslims?
Oh, I think that some of the acts of the Chechens who went and took over that school in Russia and didn't allow the kids to have water all throughout their siege is an act against Muslims.
That's not my question. That's not my question. It's the blind eye that the West turned to Russian atrocities and Russian violence against Muslims in Chechnya. You don't see that because it's cited by many Muslims around the world as evidence of a war against Islam.
This goes back to national interests and foreign policy. It does not go back to a religious war. There is no religious war. These people are not sitting down there using the Bible or the Torah in order to wage war. Israel is a secular state, so is America. The neoconservatives, in my opinion, don't seem to believe in God.
Ramzi Khouri, thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to throw it open to the audience. If you have any questions, and we certainly hope you do, you've never been shy in putting your questions beforehand, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you as soon as possible. Gentleman at the back there.
Being a Bosnian, I have witnessed that the West was observing suffering of Bosnian Muslims for 4 years, depriving them from the basic right to defend themselves, to defend their lives by putting the embargo on the weapons for Bosnian Muslims. And the help from the West came only after 200,000 people have died. Would you think that the same thing would have happened if the victims of the war were Christians, Serbs and Croats, and not Bosnian Muslims?
You're saying that you believe it is evidence of a Western war against Islam?
Yes.
Well, certainly we were very concerned about the mistreatment of the Bosnians, and we worked very hard at that. But the reason why we're not able, or we did not succeed to do it quickly enough and in time, is because the American Muslim community has not yet been sufficiently empowered. We need to build further coalitions with many other people, Christian and Jewish people, who were very concerned about the atrocities committed against the Bosnians. But again, as Ramzi pointed out, U.S. foreign policy is primarily dictated by policies of interests. And the alacrity and the quickness with which, for example, the U.S. came to the aid of Kuwait during the first Gulf War is because of the interests of oil. The issues of religion and religious war tends to intersect issues of interest, and they're governed by issues of interest. Is there a sense in the Western world of fear of Islam? Yes, there's a certain fear of Islam. And we are working very hard to combat this fear. But the fact of the matter remains that the vast majority of Muslims in the United States, in Europe, want to live there and want to be integrated into the Western fabric of society.
Okay, let me bring Anas Al-Tikriti in here.
If I may, the bringing in of the issues of Bosnia and Kosovo is one that I'm very uncomfortable with for several reasons. The first being that, firstly, this happened during the mid-90s when the present format and the structure of the war on terror was still undeveloped. This developed towards the 1998s, 1999s, and the such, and towards the new millennium. And therefore, that was outside that context. Plus, we have to realize a very important fact. Bosnia was not the first time this had happened. It wasn't the last time it has happened. The reaction of the world was for several reasons. Firstly, it was at the doorsteps of the West. That was very, very dangerous. There was a war, an all-out war happening between a country that was threatening to spill out to Europe, to create a massive economic, socio-political, religious crisis, as well as another important fact. Something that I feel uncomfortable saying, but I have to, I'm sorry. But our brothers, and my sheikh from Bosnia is white, he's fair-headed, he's blue-eyed. It matters. What happened to Rwanda? What happens in Southeast Asia? It doesn't matter that much. It's far away. We don't go to holidays over there. The Olympics weren't held over there a few years ago. It doesn't really matter.
Well, let me ask the Imam to answer that. I mean, you've made a number of points. Let him answer that.
The basic issue that I see is that the war on terror, as it has been prosecuted, is not a war that is driven by religious animus, primarily. It is driven by geopolitical interests, by economic interest, by the desire to control oil, by the desire to have an expanded geostrategic location in the world.
But he's saying there's a pattern here, aren't you? You're saying there's a pattern against Muslims, time after time after time.
But there's a partnership. To counter that, there's a partnership between the United States and many Muslim nations. The point we're trying to make here is that the prosecution of the war on terror is not predicated on an anti-Islamic agenda primarily. It's not driven by that.
You say primarily, so there is some element of it.
I'm saying it's driven. There is an element of fear in the West about Islam. There's no question about it.
Justified fear?
There's a fear because
absolutely not. I think that if we read through history, both modern and ancient, I think that we always have this dissident element within all sects and ideologies. We have never had this draconian practice against an entire community of faith.
I can tell you that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the West. It is the fastest growing religion in America. It's the fastest growing religion in...
That's despite all of us.
That's despite all of us.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason for it. That accounts for the fear. The fear is based upon the fact that by the year 2010, the 4 largest cities in Holland, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, are going to be majority Muslim cities.
The Egyptian weekly Rosa Al-Yusuf said last year, Muslims must no longer remain silent. Our fear of speaking out has become the terrorists' fifth column.
What I reject is that the presumption that we haven't been speaking out. I, as a person, I'm only 36 years old, but 20 years of my life, I've been going around preaching modernism, preaching interaction with the West. I reject entirely the suggestion by the United Kingdom, by the United States, by the West generally, that I have been silent all this time, and how come, I've always been relaxed and, laid my legs straight out and never said anything, and now I come to defend you.
Okay.
I have always been speaking.
But that point, Anas, hold on, Tim. But that point, Anas, is a function of the media. And the media coverage. We have this battle within America today. I'm continuously banging against the media. They don't give adequate coverage to us Muslims and to Muslim moderates. They give undue attention to those who give a negative image of Islam. But those of us who try to give a positive image of Islam are sidelined.
So it's a media issue, media's fault.
Not a policy issue. It's a very important difference. The majority of Westerners, the majority of Americans and U.S. policy is not guided by anti-Islam as Islam, but guided by other factors.
There's a gentleman up there who's been waiting very patiently. Sir.
My question is this, that the war against terrorism has become a war against certain types of Islam. The U.S. wants to dictate which Islam they want to enter the country, which Islam they want to put on TV, which Islam they want to talk out, which Islam to be in the books. But the other types of Islam, the people who are speaking moderate Islam in other places that don't agree with the U.S. interests, they don't get any voice.
You don't think they have a right to fight militant Islam, Islam that crashes planes into the World Trade Center?
The Muslims should themselves fight their militant Islam, and they should do that through a Muslim discourse. Someone coming outside and dictating the terms will not do anything for the Muslim extremists. It will just breed more extremism.
So you're saying that some of the Islamic clergy should have done more?
I believe so. I believe it was upon the Grand Mufti and other people like him to speak out.
He says you should have spoken out more.
I think I'm speaking very loudly, but it depends whether somebody wants to hear. What I believe, it is for the media to make news at night, better to have some Hamzas who will tell that Muslims should kill Christians and Jews than to have some moderate, boring Muslim clergy to speak about peaceful Islam. And this is what media is making. I don't want to sound like blame the media. That's the easier way. There are some people who are irresponsible and behaving on behalf of Islam. I believe, yes, I agree with you that we should be louder and tell them that they don't do this on our behalf. We Muslims want to live in peace with other people, and we have proven this through history that we are capable to do so.
Is that loud enough and clear enough for you?
I'm sorry, you missed the point. The United States government itself funds certain initiatives within the Muslim countries and within the Muslim discourse that they want to have. Some people aren't given the voices like the Grand Mufti is speaking. I agree with him totally. I think people, for example, Tariq Ramadan wasn't allowed to come to the States because they don't want that type of Islam. I think the government is funding Al-Hurra TV because they want Al-Hurra TV. They don't want Al Jazeera. They want Radio Sawa. They don't want Muslim people talking about this.
But why you are opposing what Americans are trying to do for Muslims? I don't think that anyone can change the content of Islam, even Americans, on anybody. But if Americans don't do anything, we blame America because it doesn't do. But if it does something, then we blame it because it is doing. But the United States is the only country in the world that can do and want to do something in the world. There are some people who can do, but they don't want, and others people want to do, but they cannot. I think we should be more reasonable and open for others who want to help us, and of course, provided that we help ourselves.
Okay.
Because how can somebody help me if I cannot help myself?
All right, let me bring...
Just very quickly,
Tariq
Ramadan was prevented from entering in this particular case because he made statements against Israel, just to point the issue of the Israeli connection. However, having said that, the issue, we are challenged in the West. A friend of mine, a journalist who really is very sympathetic to our situation, says the problem that the Western has, they're confused. They can understand political liberation movements. They can understand, for example, political front for the liberation of Palestine. What they cannot understand is Jama'ah Islamiyya, Hezbollah. Why is it, they said, that throughout the Muslim world, political liberation movements use the vocabulary of Islam? And until and unless we Muslims can help them de-link this link, it is hard for them not to see Islam as militant. So part of the battle that we have, both within our own tradition and vis-a-vis the West, is we need to make these de-linkages, if you will.
Okay, question from the front, please.
Yes, I have a question to Mr. Sir Ramzi. You said that the war in this region in the Middle East is against wealth or geopolitics reasons. Is that right? Okay, do you think that it's a coincidence that they only want the oil of Afghanistan or the oil of Iraq, all the resources in the other Arabic or Islamic countries, and why not they take the other resources that is in different places in the world?
The point is that America's interest in oil is because it is in Islamic states.
No, their interest
They do
in oil.
happen to have a preponderance of oil.
Yes, what I mean is like it can't be like a coincidence that all of the wealth that they seek is in Islamic states. Like there is oil, as you say, oil is important, but there is also oil in different countries in the
Oh,
world.
but the vast majority of oil reserves are here in this region. And this is extremely important. This makes this region extremely important. But I want to also look at American foreign policy. The friends of yesterday are today's enemy. The Americans supported the Mujahideen in order to attack the Soviet Union. They gave them arms, they gave them wealth, they opened the door for them, and they became strong. They didn't need them anymore. They became their enemies today. Those Islamist Shiites in Iraq, who are allies of the United States in Iraq today, only a couple of years back, were the enemy of the United States of America.
Okay, Anas Al-Tikriti, you wanted to come in here.
There is a problem within the West in regards with when the rhetoric that we emit, we broadcast, contains Islamic references. The liberation efforts and the such are fine, as you said, although I also have my reservations regarding that. But the problem is this interrelationship between Islam and politics, Islam and these liberation movements. I think that we have tried, and this is where I say that we have been failed time and time again. The media is part of it, but it's not just the media. There is a predominant ideology there that wishes to
Can we get back to the motion
than the moderate mainstream. The issue is that we, as Muslims, the vast majority of the Muslim public, whether the Arab world or beyond, have chosen to exercise politics with the Islamic reference. Now, that, if it's going to be rejected, then I'm sure that we're going to be in for this.
Okay, let me take a question from the lady up there.
It may be that the intention of this war is not exactly a war on Islam itself. Maybe not the intention. But the fact is that many Muslims, many women that wear hijab, and many men that have beards in the United States or in other Western countries feel discriminated against and feel as if they're named just because they are Muslim, that they're discriminated against and that they should be out of this country. I know, family relatives who have to leave the United States for this reason because they're discriminated against just because of the hijab or, their beards.
How do you answer that?
The underlying question you point out is an important one. And that is the difference between perception and reality. What we've tried to show thus far is that what drives U.S. policy is not anti-Islam as such. Are there certain individuals, perhaps individuals in positions of influence, who have a fear of Islam? No doubt about it. But you have to look at the preponderance of evidence. The preponderance of evidence, the preponderance of what the U.S. policy is driven by very clearly indicates that there is not hostility to Islam as such, but things that are offensive to Islam that are that.
Okay, let me ask the question
is there
of whether
is there a perception in the Muslim world that there is? Yes, there is. But perceptions are not reality, and it's very important for us to advocate against that linkage, because we can make this a war of religion.
Let's ask the question of whether she accepts what you've been saying.
Okay, so you're saying you agree that the perception of the world is that, for example, the woman wearing the hijab is discriminated against. If these people are being discriminated against, does that not mean that this is a war on Muslims? Therefore, if it's a war on Muslims, it's a war on Islam. How do you define that in the United States or in other Western countries?
Well, that's too simplistic, because even the Muslims in France, for instance, supported the government in its position. The issues within these particular nations, they didn't want the interference of outside of non-Muslims on this internal issue between French Muslims and their government. There is an issue of how to integrate Muslims within Western societies, and that is part of what we have to do. But the big important point, which we really have to remember very much, is that we can shape this war the way we want. If we are more proactive, if Muslims are more proactive, if they are able to advocate their issues well in Washington, D.C., and be stronger in our lobbying capacity, we can shape this war. If we allow this to slip into a religious war, it is going to be dangerous.
Okay, gentleman at the back.
My question is, would the Western reaction to the atrocities of 9/11 and Madrid have been less forceful had it not been a Muslim faction that had accepted responsibility for these acts?
Grand Mufti, do you want to take that question?
I think that even before 11th of September, and Madrid and Holland, I think some Muslims would complain. But the 11th of September gave the courage to other people around the world to somehow develop something against Muslims and Islam that we didn't see before. Let me.
So you think people are using that as a pretext to attack Muslims?
Probably. Most of, especially those dictators around the world that wanted to please the President Bush's determination to go after those who have committed this terror or terrorism in New York and in Washington. And then, unfortunately, I think that President Bush apologized later on when he used the term crusade. I know that for many Christians, the crusade means good things, a lot of good things, crusade for education, other things. But for Muslims, it means only one thing, the war against Islam and Muslims. In the same way as the jihad for Muslims means many good things. But for the Christians and Jews and others, non-Muslims, jihad means only one thing, violence against them.
Okay,
so
let's see if the questioner is convinced by what you've been saying.
That we should avoid using both crusade and jihad in order to avoid the embarrassment of all.
You're going to impose that in Bosnia. You have the
we are imposing already.
You're imposing it already.
Yes.
Okay, are you satisfied with the answer you had?
Not really. If it had been North Korea that had done the attacks on 9/11, it would have just been just as forceful an act against that country as any other. And it's not just solely because there's this perceived disdain for Islam in America and Western countries.
You want to come back to that?
No.
Can I ask the gentleman a question? Do you realize that the vast majority, if not every single Muslim state, condemned outrightly 9/11? In fact, indeed, including the Taliban government themselves? Does it make a difference in our perception, in our minds, that every single mainstream Muslim organization living in the Muslim world as well as the West has condemned time and time again for the past 4 years, 9/11, and they will continue seemingly to do so for the next 10 or 15 years?
Gentleman towards the back there.
The question is, what if I was a citizen of Turkey? How would I feel if my country was not allowed to enjoy the benefits of the European Union just because the majority of its members are Muslims?
Well, certainly that is we agree with you, and we agree with the position of Mustafa Cheric on the fact that the perception in much of the Muslim world is that the reason why Turkey is not admitted into the European Union is because it is an Islamic nation.
It may well be admitted into the European Union.
And it may well be yet. So but the fact of
argument about Turkey, it's very interesting, and I think it's proof to our motion. And that is because those who accept Turkey are saying it's left behind Islam. And those who are rejecting Turkey, it's saying it hasn't left Islam enough. So in either case,
I don't think that's the argument of everybody, that it's left behind Islam. That it's a bridge between Islam and the rest of Europe. A lot of people are citing that as a reason.
That's a very minute element, and I wish that they would have bigger microphones in front of them when they speak.
Gentleman wants to come back.
The fact of the matter is,
let the questioner.
There are two points.
Could we
here.
just let the questioner come back here, because he just wants to make another point.
I do realize that in time, Turkey will hopefully get accepted to European Union because it is just decision. The fact that it has not been for so many years been admitted this position just because of the fact it's a majority Muslim country.
It is also its human rights record as well, which has come under a lot of criticism, isn't it?
Excuse me, repeat that?
It's also its human rights record, which has received a lot of criticism. That's also been cited by those who oppose Turkey's membership into the European Union. You have to acknowledge that.
I certainly do. But what about the Pope's statement? How do we comment on that?
Which one?
As Dr. Serch has pointed out, that Turkey should not be accepted because it's a Muslim country. And in fact, I don't realize this. Turkey is not declared as a Muslim country.
You wanted to make a point.
Yes, 2 points. First of all, that the question on Turkey's admission to the European Union is not yet a closed story. And point number 2, that it's not relevant to our discussion on the war on terror.
Exactly.
The war on terror is a war, as we have described, consisted of 2 parts, broadly. The war on 2 fronts. In Afghanistan, as Ramzi pointed out, this war was supported by Yasser Arafat, by the Iranians, by the vast majority of the Muslim nations. The second leg of the war on terror, namely the occupation of Iraq, is again not a war against Islam as Muslims, because the end result is that, in fact, the Islamist groups in Iraq today are partnering with the United States. So the proposition of this debate tonight, that the war on terror has become a war on Islam, let's define the war on terror. The war on terror, whether in Afghanistan or in Iraq, is not evidence of a war on Islam.
Okay, lady at the back, we'll take a question from you, please.
Just briefly, I was in Germany when 9/11 happened, and my perception there was that the reason that they chose to dive bomb the World Trade Center was because for the Islamic world, the insidious encroachment of our American culture is in direct conflict with very many things that they believe, and that's an impossible thing for them to fight back against.
You say American policies justify the death of 2,500 people on 9/11. Is that your point?
No, that's not my point at all. My point is why...
Sounded very like it.
Why do Muslims feel it's necessary to attack the West? Go back one step further.
Grand Mufti, do you want to take this?
How can we feel? I think that the question is too hard on us, saying that Muslims feel need to attack the West. The 11th of September, I suffer now as a Muslim in the world more than the Americans are suffering. And because of that, I am against that more than you can imagine. Because the Jews were accused that they killed Jesus for 10 centuries, and they suffered in Europe. Now, I think the role is of the Muslims, that we are going to be accused generations after generations after generations that some Muslims have done. And I don't know these Muslims, whether they are Muslims or not. I am not sure, because if they are sincere Muslims, they are not wise and they would not do that. If they are not Muslims, then therefore they did that exactly against Muslims and Islam, not in the favor of Islam against the West.
Thank you, Grand Mufti. Gentlemen at the second row.
The war is a multicultural war, and many Muslim nations are part of it. For example, the elected Iraqi government is fighting a war against terrorist militants. Is that a war against Islam as well?
The problem is that now everyone who has a grudge against one of its groups or traits of its communities all of a sudden declare that it's a war on terror and you're okay. Iraq never ever, despite the dark days of Saddam, never ever had one single Iraqi been implicated in one act of terrorism around the world. Not one single suicide bombing happened in Iraq until after the war and the subsequent occupation. The reason why now Iraq is being classified as a bedrock of terrorism is because of the war and the subsequent occupation. And the effort to quell that is an effort that I support if it was a sincere effort. But the problem is it's not, it's an insincere effort.
Okay, you wanted to come back on that. Could you stand up, please?
If Muslims defend themselves, it's not a war against Islam, but Western countries do not have the right to defend themselves against terrorist
Defend themselves in Iraq? No, they don't have the right to do that.
No, Iraqi government is defending its citizens in Iraq. Is that a war against Islam or not?
If the effort by any government instilled was sincere to quell terrorism, not to instill and reinforce the presence of the occupation, every single Iraqi would support that, including myself.
There is no hypothetical situation. There's a current situation right now. Is that a war on Islam or not? The thing that's taking place right now.
Which one?
We have people...
Can I just say something?
No, he's just defining his question, please.
I'm responding to that particular question that he just asked. And that is, we mustn't simplify everything and make every single, policeman stopping someone who's driven above the speed limit to be an act of war on terror. Please, we're not simplifying issues. We're talking about, there are, yes, acts of injustice and inhumanity that are merely for certain reasons, possibly some of them oil, such as Ramzi said. But the predominant element that is happening today, the wars that are being fought, not the effort of Ja'fari or Allawi to fight some invisible entity within Iraq, those are wars against Islam.
We've come to the point in the proceedings where we're going to ask you to make up your mind about the motion. This House believes that the war on terror has become a war on Islam. Please take the voting machines that you have. If you are for the motion, please press button 1, the yellow one. If you're against it, press 2, the red button. And would you please do it now? You only have to do it once. You don't have to keep pressing. Will you please press the button now?
Should we vote?
Just once. No, you don't vote. You've had your say. You've had your say. It's up to the audience now. We're getting the results of the vote now. They should be coming up on the screen. And they're looking very even. 4 49.6 against. Against the motion, 50.4%. The motion has been rejected just by a small margin of error.
Very good, very good. Half and half.
Let me thank our eminent panelists, and let me thank you, the audience, as well. We'll be back in a month's time. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We hope you'll join us again. Have a safe journey home. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.